Welcome. Johanna Schein is here today for the Path to Follow podcast, episode number 5. We are getting ready to have our conversation, and I'm super excited to talk to Johanna today. We've gone back and forth in the hallways since the beginning of the year about this podcast, and she is an absolute wealth of information. She is the Gilman School archivist, and her job basically is, going through all the records from Gilman School, all the history, and supplying our community with everything we need to know about Gilman's past. So to start, Johanna, welcome. I'm very excited to talk to you today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
So maybe to start off, can you talk a little bit about what you do at Gilman and kind of how you found this place? How did you get here?
Sure. So this is actually my 5th school year at Gilman. And as you mentioned, I'm the archivist, and that means I oversee our historic collection, everything from the photographs, film, records that are created as part of doing business, so records from the headmaster's office, board of trustees, that are institutional records, and some special collections. So Walter Lord from the class of 35, he donated a lot of his materials to Gilman, so there's some unique materials there too. And in general, day-to-day changes a lot. I do some teaching, like some specials for classes. I also work a lot with the Development and Alumni Relations Office, so a lot of the reunions. It's a big part of my job is preparing for those reunions. Special events like the 50th anniversary of Black Alumni, 100 years of wrestling last year. We're approaching our 125th in 2022, so that's a big thing coming up. So that's a good chunk of my time at Gilman.
So you mentioned Walter Lord, and he's
Yes.
one of the people that I saw when I was preparing a little bit this morning for our conversation. I was just looking on the website because there are a few pages on there that explain what you do, and there's some of the archives are online that people can access. But Walter Lord was an interesting figure that I didn't really know too much about. Can you talk a little bit about him and what he has done for Gilman? He was a student here. He was a writer, correct? And he's kind of supplied a lot of the materials that we look at today.
So Walter Lord is most well known for the book A Night to Remember. I don't know if you've read it, but I'd recommend it. It's about the sinking of the Titanic, and we read it in the 6th grade here, and that sort of put him on the map. He wrote, I think, 13 books in total, and they are history books. He took a narrative perspective in his history, so he tells the story from a human perspective, so you can sort of feel like you're a part of it. So A Night to Remember talks about, I think those 72 hours of the sinking of the ship. And he was a Gilman grad, and what I find most interesting about him is that right after he graduated, he started giving back to Gilman. So he actually established the history prize. I think it's the Herbert Pickett Prize.
Mm-hmm.
I hope I have that name correct. So he established that right after he graduated while he was still a student at Princeton. And he mentored generations of Gilman students. So he was a pretty famous author, and he would continue to mentor, and he gave back some of his artifacts, some of his historic collections to the school while he was alive. And then as part of his estate after he passed away, I believe in 2012. I might have that year a little off. But what's fun is that the students still read A Night to Remember now, so I'll present to them, the 6th graders. We have some of his childhood. He did a childhood newspaper. I don't know if you saw that. I think you'd be interested in it because he has his cartoons in his childhood newspaper.
Oh, did he do cartoons too?
Some, yes. Oh, and
yeah.
He was a big ship fan. He loved historic ships and shipwrecks, and so there's some illustrations that he has of like the Titanic, and he did his senior speech, for instance, about the Titanic, the sinking of the Titanic.
I wonder what interested him so much about the Titanic and how he got...
So apparently his aunt had a book on her bookshelf that covered the Titanic a little bit, and I think from the age of 8 on, he was obsessed with the Titanic. He convinced his family to go on the Olympia, a sister ship of the Titanic that was still sailing. So when he was about 8 years old, they toured on the ship, and we have photos of that. We have some of his family's travel logs. And that is a unique collection. I would say most of our collection is very specific to Gilman. We are an institutional archive. But because he was so connected with Gilman, we've accepted his as a special collection. So you'll hear that often, like archives and special collections. So like Harvard has things that don't directly relate to Harvard. That relates to just things they've collected within their mission.
Yep.
So that's Walter Lord's collection. And last summer we got an additional donation when they were finally closing out the final remains of his estate. So we did that inventory last year, which is why we have that information online that you can see what we have.
Got it.
That's why big part of what archivists do is describe the material so that it can be accessible.
Is that collection in your office, or is that in, I know the middle school library is called the Walter Lord Library. Is that in there, or where can people find that?
Most of the collection is in the archives, which is located in Cary Hall.
Yep.
There's a model ship of the Titanic that's in the library, as well as some of his spoons. He has these nautical spoons.
Wow.
There's also a little display case in the middle school that has his pencils. So he didn't throw away his pencils, and he says when he's writing, he knew I'm going to mess this phrase up, but he would say it's not complete if the ink is dry, but if the eraser is dry. So the erasers are all done on those pencils, like because he'd keep on writing and erasing. So he has a collection of over 100 pencils. I think when he originally donated them, he's like, well, let's just give them out to students as prizes. But they work better as a collection together.
Yeah, wow.
So that's the middle school. But most of his materials, we've got one of his manuscript collections from his first book, and some of his research notes and odds and ends.
I saw also you wrote a book on Dunkirk, and when they made the movie, I think a couple years ago, they were using all of his research and what he wrote in that book too.
Yeah, so it's not based off of the book directly, so they didn't pay royalties.
Got it.
But they used that for research, and when that movie came out, the book sales went up. And the nice thing about what Walter Lord did is he actually donated the rights to the school.
Wow.
So we get some financial benefit still to this day from Walter Lord's estate.
What an interesting guy.
Yes.
What are some of the other collections we have here at Gilman that people can either find online? I know we have a lot online. I was even online on Digital Maryland today looking at some of the old photographs from, I run the Gilman Lacrosse Instagram page, and I was pulling up 1967 a lacrosse game against McDonough, and
Sure.
I'm really interested in that kind of thing, and just looking at how Gilman has changed and how it's stayed the same. But for students, for parents, for alumni, where can they find some more collections and more material to look at?
Yeah, I think so. The photograph collection is one of our most used collections. I would say probably about 5 to 10% of all of our photographs are on Digital Maryland, so it's not a large part of our collection. Last year I had some students who were interning in the afternoon, volunteering in the afternoons to help describe photographs so that we could put them online. Because an image itself, if you just have it scanned and it's just some numbers, it's useless unless you have the metadata and you have the description there. Because that's how you found it.
Right, and I loved how it has the player's name, a little bit about them. Yeah. Because I'm looking for that when I post and I put a caption down. I need people want to know who this is that they're looking at. Yeah.
Yes, of course. So Digital Maryland, you can get through. Often it's just easier to Google Gilman School Archives and just go get to the archive site through that. There's a link on the archive site. Digital Maryland is run through Enoch Pratt Free Library. It's a central repository for a lot of small institutions, archives, special collections, to host their photographs. So I think we have, actually I have no idea how many photos we have right now up there. It might be 1,000.
Yeah, there were pages. I went through probably 40 pages this morning. I'm just looking at.
Yeah, so we should have most of the earliest photographs up that I think got through the 1930s. With the students over the last 2 years working on that. And it's been interesting just to see the variety of photographs. I think you start seeing the ice hockey team in the 1930s. There was a short-lived ice hockey team then.
Yep.
1930s, I guess, is when lacrosse starts as well. I believe it's 34, 32,
somewhere
really? Around there.
Okay.
It starts as a club team, I think. there's all this information that's floating, and without the
How about
the source.
How about football? That extends even further back.
Yes.
Some of the, like, even early 90s, there's images of McDonough and Gilman playing football.
Yeah. So to take a step back, when Gilman was established, athletics was always part of its core day and mission. 1897, there was athletics. The teams didn't get competitive until about 1900, but that's still pretty early on in our history.
Definitely.
There's some great photographs of, for instance, the earliest football team with their nose guards. Maybe we can put it in.
Yeah.
Where they got their nose guards, and I like showing it for the lower school students, sort of guess where the students are and guess what they are doing, and the clues in the photographs to try to figure out, well, what sport is this?
Yep.
And there's some good photos of the students in front of in front of Homewood House, now the Homewood Museum, playing football. So we, in the early 1900s, started to get competitive in football and baseball as well. Baseball was one of the earliest sports. 1914 was the first McDonough game.
Okay.
There were 2 years, 1916 and 1918, that we didn't play McDonough because of the flu, the influenza.
And I did see some photos. So Henry Smythe, our headmaster, did a whole assembly on the outdoor classroom from 1911 to, 1922?
Yes.
Where there was an outdoor classroom at Gilman just to slow the spread of, was it the Spanish flu, or was it just...
Yeah, it's a good story. So tuberculosis.
Okay.
Although now I'm double thinking. So the open air school is a larger movement. So Germany was sort of the educational reformers at that time. And the thought was, if it was to help children that were sick, because it was found that the open air was helpful for slowing the spread of disease, well, maybe it could help healthy students as well and help stimulate their minds. And if you think about the turn of the century, what's going on, there's a lot of sort of like the City Beautiful movement. There's a lot of industrialization in the city and congestion in the city, and there's a lot of focus, well, maybe outside is better. And that's the same movement that's sort of pushing the country school movement, which Gilman was a part of. Maybe in the country, it'll help the students learn. And the next step of that is, in addition to being in the country, maybe being outside is what we need. So the lower school students from 1911 to 1922 were part of the open air school. So you see it on their sweatshirts. It'll say OAS, which stands for Open Air School.
Was their whole day outside? Were they outside all day?
Their whole day was outside.
Even in the winter months, because if you look at pictures and I think I was telling Henry this, if you go on Wikipedia and look at Gilman School, some of the pictures are open air school with kids outside in their big, what do you even call those? Hoodies or?
I don't think they're called hoodies, but I'm not exactly sure of the language. But I think Harry Potter's waned in popularity, but for a while that was called the Harry Potter outfits with their big jackets on and their
big
hats.
Hoods, yeah. It's like what are these kids
so
wearing?
they were provided for by the school. That was part of their uniform, but they have these soapstones, the boxes on their feet. They would go to the stove in the morning, take out the hot soapstones, essentially like coals, put them in the boxes, warm their feet up. And it started just as like one class in 1911, and then by 1922 it was over 100 students. I was flipping through, I was trying to figure out sort of the progression of why it ended. And I think it was expanding, they needed more space, and over time they started building more walls because the teachers weren't really thrilled about teaching outside at all times. So the traditional lower school building opened in 1922, and they said that it would have all the good qualities that you'd find in the open air school. So there's supposed to be sort of open hallways and good ventilation, but more heat.
Yeah.
And then eventually the walls sort of started coming up to make separate spaces.
And now in 2020 we're back to open air school.
And we have tents.
We have tents set up, and we're trying to get out there as much as we can, especially in the fall. I think it's going to change in the winter. Like, we're not going out there much, but
we might.
Yeah, who knows? You can't speak for the future.
I saw something. There's no bad weather, just bad clothing.
Yep,
just
exactly.
Gotta layer up.
We might need to add those hoodies or whatever they were to
space heaters for sure, at least.
Yep. Awesome. Well, that's so interesting. And if people want to look, I think Wikipedia, you can just go to Wikipedia to see one of those pictures.
Yeah,
but...
there is. I did write a blog post about the open air school, or about epidemics in general at Gilman. I think you can get that through the archives website.
Is it your personal blog or is it?
No, sorry, through the Lumen blog. That's
Oh.
through Gilman School.
I didn't even know about that. Is that you update that regularly or
somewhat regularly?
Sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes.
Okay, cool. Awesome. So, Johanna, how did you kind of find this path? How did you get to be a school archivist? What struck your interest, and how did you know about Gilman? How did you get here?
Yeah. So longer life story. My mother, when I was in my lower middle school age, started the archives at my synagogue. They were about to celebrate a big anniversary. Their records were a mess. She's an accountant by trade, but decided that she was going to take this on as a project, got a big federal grant. So when I was in high school, I started volunteering for her, just doing some inventory work. I don't think I was passionate for archives at the time, but it did expose me to that as a field.
Got it.
Because I don't think a lot of 15-year-olds necessarily think of archives. I wound up going to Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and I loved it. And there I was an American Studies major. And I had a great advisor, great mentor, David Schuyler, who pushed me into historical research. I did a lot of research in the F&M archive. When I did interviews, it was for a big oral history project for them. They were doing 40 years of coeducation. And we did a lot of research in the archives and a lot of engaging with the community in essentially a public history project to document 40 years of coeducation.
So did you do interviews and podcast conversations like this? Did you record them?
I think it was pre-podcast era.
Pre-podcast era. It was some of the first podcasts.
It was, yes. I don't think it was. We still had. I remember, and it was not that long ago, but it was with my cassette player on the desk as the backup. We had a digital one, but we still had the cassette player too.
Yep.
So you always have backups. That's what you learn. You always have the backups. So that was it was a great exposure to oral histories, and as I mentioned, public history, and that got me interested in the field of public history, which is actually what my degree is in.
So
it's not
American Studies.
Well, sorry, my master's degree. I guess I jumped ahead there a little.
Okay. So when did you, right after college, you knew what you wanted to do and you went to go get your master's, or?
So I interned at the National Archives so one summer I did this oral history project for coeducation. That was my junior to senior year. My sophomore to junior year. My junior to senior year, I applied for and got an internship at the National Archives at the Center for Legislative Archives. And that was one of my favorite experiences.
Where is that?
In D.C., at the National Archives and Records Administration.
Got it.
The Center for Legislative Archives holds the records of Congress.
Wow, that's a great experience.
It was a great experience.
Yeah.
And like so many internships, I think why it was a great experience is because I met good people there. And I had really good mentors that exposed me to different avenues for exploring my interest in history. So when I was there, I did a project they were putting up an exhibition a few years later about amending the Constitution and constitutional amendments and the petition process, and there's hundreds of proposed amendments that did not make it into our Constitution. So I did a lot of research in their records at the Legislative Archives, at the National Archives, looking through petitions from all over, anti-slavery petitions, child labor petitions, oleomargarine stuff, but that was a little different. Odds and ends. But it showed me that that personally I had a great interest in research and sharing information.
And that extended back all the way from, when you're in high school and you were working with your mom and, got into a little bit more in college, and then you knew what you wanted to do.
So exactly. Thank you. From there, one of my mentors at the National Archives was a public historian as her degree. And so from college, I was thinking I'd hopefully get a job first, but it was 2011, and museum and archive field, it's really challenging to get a job without a master's degree.
Yep.
So I had, after that summer, I had worked out a student worker position at the National Archives in the same office, so they paid me for that summer. But then I went and worked at the special collections at UMBC and was a graduate student in their public history program at UMBC. So thankfully, I'm fortunate to have a funded master's program, which it makes all the difference.
It definitely does. It definitely does.
It makes all the difference.
Did you go from UMBC and that's kind of how you found out about Gilman and got here, or?
Well, in a roundabout way, yes, but no. So from UMBC, I worked in their special collections during the school year, and then back at the National Archives during the summer as a student worker. After I graduated from UMBC, I couldn't be a student worker anymore, and the federal government is very complicated in their hiring process. I did, though, continue working at the Legislative Archives for about a year and a half more, funded through ProQuest. I sort of like to say I was reading C-SPAN all day, so I was screening records before they could be open to the public, just for information that couldn't be released, so like social security numbers, things that we have to keep by law private, no conspiracy theories, just technical stuff, really. So I did that for a year and a half. After that, I did 2 years at the American History Museum. So I hopped
down
over.
DC too,
yeah,
right?
The Smithsonian National Museum of American History.
Got it. Okay.
And I was their collections documentation specialist. So in order for material to go online, I verified legal title. I verified that the Smithsonian actually owned the material by looking through their paperwork. So pretty archive-based. And then I also did some editing for them as well for the online catalog. So I did that for 2 years. And then I got to Gilman. And the reason I got to Gilman is because someone I worked with at UMBC was the archivist before me.
Oh, wow. Who's that?
So Steve Amadown. He is now at Bowling Green University in Ohio, and he loved this job. Mm-hmm. And he started Twitter for this job, and he's very big on social media.
Really? What year was this? When was he here? That must have been early social media, no?
No. This was 2015.
Oh, he was here in 2015?
Yeah, I started in September 2016.
Got it, okay.
And he got a job as the pop culture archivist out there, which was his absolute dream job. So even though he loved it here...
What is a pop culture archivist?
You'd have to ask him. Romance novels, I think.
Yeah.
He runs a romance novel conference. Good person.
Yeah.
Very
great.
And I say that.
He'd be interesting. He'd be interesting to get on the podcast too.
He would. He would. He would do it too.
Do you keep in touch with him at all, or?
Through Twitter. I called him a lot when we first started. There's a lot of advantages of knowing the person. So I have an office of one.
Yep.
I work with marketing communications, but it really is. The archives is under my jurisdiction. When Brooke Blumberg, who's my supervisor, when she hired me, she stated, "I'm hiring you as the expert. I can help be your advocate, but at the end of the day, it's up to you to decide how things are running." So it was very useful to be able to call Steve and say, "Hey, what am I supposed to do?"
Right.
Not exactly. Or ask specific questions about our collection. So when he found out, I guess it was March 2016, that he had gotten the job in Ohio, and he said, "Well, this might be opening up. You should apply." And I knew from him how much he enjoyed working at Gilman and the people here and the projects. And he had started some great collaborations in the classrooms that we've continued with today. So when he said, I'm like, all right.
Yeah.
DC is great. There's a lot of, I worked with cool materials, really world-class collections at the Smithsonian and the National Archives. Is the records of our government.
Yep.
Like they're essential material. At the same time, there's a lot of disadvantages with working for the federal government. It's sort of being that small fish in a big pond, and it's hard to make changes, and it's hard to... There's a lot of bureaucracy. What they say is true.
Right.
So it's a sort of a completely different atmosphere to be in a school setting.
Especially as the archivist and, being the person basically in charge of everything. You're very independent now, and that's got to feel great and definitely different from your old position, but I personally would like that a little bit more, I think.
I had a third grader about a year ago ask me which I liked more. I said, absolutely Gilman.
That's a big question.
Hands down. Yeah. We finished a lesson and they were sort of quiz the archivist, and they could ask anything. You
go down to the lower school and do different lessons with the younger kids, or?
Yes. So I would say third grade is the main lower school hub. They had an archaeology unit. I think they still might, but we sort of tied that into archives and primary source. This year it's been me recording videos for them. Mm-hmm. Hopefully we'll figure out a way to do something more live.
What are some things you teach the third grade? What do you bring up in conversation with the third graders?
So there's both what is an archives and what's a primary source. So the general, this is how we study and how we analyze. The Library of Congress has a great format for the think, analyze, and question, or see. I'm going to get those wrong. Mm-hmm. But using that format to analyze the primary source, there's also specific subjects. So they read a book about baseball, and I present about baseball. Great. So normally in the fall, there's a general, here's a collection of materials. I like holding up like a VHS tape or a cassette, something that makes me feel old and the teachers feel old, and have the students guess it. They got the floppy disk, I think, because the save icon isn't there anymore. So I don't know if they'd know the floppy disk, but I think the VHS is in some video game. They got it from that.
Yep.
So it's fun, and I change sort of the objects that I bring each year. It tends to, though, be technology from over several periods of our history. So like glass plate negatives are some of our earliest photographs. Mm-hmm. So it's fun to hold those up and have them guess.
Yeah.
I try not to trick the students, but sometimes guessing is the way to get more
some
information.
Interest.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And you do some intern type programs with the older guys here at Gilman too, so they can elect to come into your office and look through old files and old materials, I guess, during their senior year, right? Or is it any time?
So it's been flexible, and the obvious caveat right now is 2020 is a little weird. So when I came to Gilman, I'll just go back a little more. Mm-hmm. 2016 of the fall, my first week in September, I had a student come up to me and say, "Hi, is there an archives club?" And I look around. I'm like, "Well, where are we? What's going on?" I was blown away because brand new here, hadn't really met any students yet. Mm-hmm. So I tell them, "No, there's no archives club. Let me get your name, and I'll talk to your advisor to make sure everything's okay." So I talked to Diane Fowler. It's like, "Well, if a student's interested, he's only in 9th grade, but can he come and intern?" She's like, "Go for it." So this is Jordan Bernardi. He started in 9th grade interning with me and was with me for 4 years and 2 summers as a paid student worker then.
Okay.
In addition to his work, so he worked on a lot of the photographs. He did a lot of the class reunion prep, which is going through their photographs, getting things ready for the spring. There's a lot of work just on the back end.
When you go through photographs like that, what exactly are you doing with the photographs? Are you just organizing them into collections, or are you analyzing the photographs at all, or what does that involve?
For the reunions, which again are mostly from the last 50 years, it's getting them in one place, scanning them, writing the descriptions, photo identification sometimes, mm-hmm. like if they're in the yearbook, seeing if there's a caption there. It's sort of a baseline, though, really, just trying to make them accessible. A big thing about the archives is that you are keeping material to make them available. And how you make them available is through description, digitization, and I guess those are the big ways, and putting it out there.
Yep.
Visibility. So it's not like a lock and key situation. We need to keep things behind lock and key to keep them secure for future generations. Mm-hmm. But things that are coming in, the hope is that they will be used in the future. So the photo project, it's to get them accessible. And how do you get them accessible? You have to actually have the description there. It has to be organized. So there's a big thing online where people say, oh, look what I discovered in the archives, which is great. And it's fun to have that experience. But often it's because there was labor.
Did the work.
There was labor behind it to make it accessible.
They don't just show up online.
No, it doesn't just, and you as a researcher doesn't just come to the archives requesting that box that already has some label and then discovering it.
Right.
Somebody had to put it. Now, the flip side of that means there could be some bias. That means that archives are not neutral, that there is a process that is involved with what to keep and what not to keep. So it's not a perfect system by any means.
Gotcha. So what is the digitization part? What does that involve? Because one thing I'm impressed with, and when I post the like throwback images to the lacrosse Instagram, is how much is on the yearbooks. Like you can go to Gilman's website and look at all the yearbooks from 1900 to today. So how does that work? How do you get all those yearbook pages up online?
Vendors do
that. Okay. You're not doing that in your office.
It's a cost benefit situation. So there's only me, and some student help. But for projects that are larger in scale, it makes more sense to send them to vendors that is their whole job to digitize material. It's not as easy. I mean, there is, again, some back-end work on our part because you can't just get 1,000 files back without description and organization. So, for instance, we just got a transfer from the athletic center of about 160 athletic films. So I can't just send them off to be digitized and say, all right, here are a bunch of files back. The first step is to go through, organize them I organize by sport and date and file size, or film size rather. Put them into a spreadsheet so that we know what we have, and when we send it out, we know what we'll be getting back.
Got it. Yeah, you have to keep track of it just so you don't lose anything, or keep everything in place.
Yeah, and then if somebody's interested in I know we've got 1969 lacrosse. Well, look, now we have this.
Yep.
We can find this easier. So there is. I think this is what I enjoy about working at Gilman, is that I do that organization in addition to teaching, in addition to interacting with students. So I'd worked with Jordan. I also last year we had afternoon blocks, and I had over the course of the year, about 18 students that rotated through the archives. Some helped with very specific projects. A few students, because of the way scheduling worked, I only saw about 5-6 times. But it was a good time just to get to know them. They got to know what the archives has. And the nice thing about being at a school is I feel like there's just mentorship, I would say, or just a chance to get to know students and know what their interests are, and their interests in academics or athletics. Students, they're
and
fascinating.
and you get to show them what you're passionate about, because if I'm a student in Gilman and I'm trying to do my social studies class and my English class, my math class, my chemistry class, I might not even think about the Gilman School archivist and what she does every day. And the club afternoon blocks that we have gives them a chance to say, I wonder what's going on in that office. Let me go down and help out.
And I think it's important to know that where we are has a history.
Absolutely.
And that it's not just brand new just for them. And I think sometimes it can be powerful. I think, for instance, talking about lacrosse history and a legacy, and same thing with football, talking about a legacy of excellence and expectations. I think knowing that history gives you a greater sense of purpose. I think nowadays we're also doing a lot of research about community equity, community inclusion equity.
Yep.
And part of that research has to be also looking back and knowing where we've struggled, where we faltered, and areas that we can, be proud of as well.
Absolutely.
So I think that's why having a presence as the archivist and as an archive, as a historic collection, is a great value, and it's something that Gilman should continue with, and that it's not just for alumni and reunions, but also the current community, faculty, students, larger community as well.
Yeah, and I think that's why I really wanted to have you on today, is because so many people people should be interested in Gilman's past. And I think the history of Gilman and history in general is so complicated and so complex. And what you do every day is to go through those complexities and, look at everything that went into making Gilman the place it is today. So I think it would be awesome for more students to get involved with what you do. But I think that internship program and, the third grade stuff that you're doing right now is pretty cool. What are some of the other projects that you're getting into right now? Are you assembling for the, I guess, 125th that's coming up, or?
That's big.
Yeah.
That's big. We have nothing concrete I can announce at this point, but there's a lot that's going toward it. I think this year sort of put a wrench in a lot of people's plans, and my current approach for the last few months is how can I support faculty during this time, because I think that's the biggest need for the school and alumni, because we had to change our whole reunions and our whole outreach. So it's been a lot of sort of concrete projects. I've had some fun doing videos for history.
I've seen that. What are you doing with that? How are you, I guess, managing or looking into those videos that you have?
Well, I'm talking about videos, lessons.
Oh, the lessons.
Yes.
Lessons. Yeah. But you're also...
Which videos are you talking about?
The lacrosse film videos that you were showing me and the football videos. What are you doing with those?
Send them out to get digitized, hopefully.
Okay. Someone else does all that.
Well, we don't have the technology here to digitize the 16 millimeter, 8 millimeter film.
Okay.
So that was the big project that I think I was referring to before, where I was inventorying the lacrosse versus...
From the athletic department.
From the athletic department. And it should be... We've got films that go back to the 1950s.
Yeah, you can look on YouTube and type in...
Yeah, so that was phase one of that.
Gilman lacrosse, like 1930s, and you can see him out there playing lacrosse or playing football, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, and I had reached out to GTV to see if they'd be interested. We have coming out soon, probably not by the time this comes out, but we... partnered with the Athletics and Development Office, put together a Gilman-McDonough rivalry page that goes through the century of games. So it has highlights from each decade, photos, videos, coaches, some statistics. It'll be a good landing page, and I would love to get that for the other sports as well. About 2 years ago, Keyshawn Jones, I don't know if you know him, he graduated. For a senior encounter, he did a project where he looked at our athletic records, looked at our athletic website, and put together a proposal for how we can update our athletic website to reflect our athletic records, because we do have a fair amount of athletic records, and it varies by sports. And before you ask, no, I don't necessarily have who was the best defenseman and their individual records. I'm talking about larger macro records.
Team records and wins and losses.
Yes, and we do have, through the yearbooks and the Gilman News, ways to pull out highlights. So it won't be everything, but it could be an interesting point. I think a lot of our alumni and potentially your students could be interested in knowing the history of the sport that they're playing.
Absolutely, and I think you're seeing some of that on this, at least I am, on this lacrosse Instagram. Every Thursday, Throwback Thursday, I'm getting some engagement from old alumni or commenting and saying, like, I think today...
posted on a Tuesday.
Right. Yeah, I posted on Tuesday. But I was getting ready for this podcast, and I was looking at all the records. I can't not post these photos, so I'll keep that going. But it's been great to see people get excited about it because, again, like I think it's awesome for people to look back and see where, the history of Gilman, especially Gilman lacrosse, is.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you're doing what you're doing because I do a lot of outreach as part of my job. But I'm also eager for other people to take the material and run with it.
Because it's all there.
It's all, and I try to make it accessible. So, like Max Stern, who's a senior now, he did a video about our history. Hopefully, it's still under wraps, but it's for our 125th, using some of the material, and he's very into video making and being creative, so it was a perfect project for him. So I like seeing when students take the material and sort of run with it. And hopefully in the future we can have more collaborations where the students, I think, like the photography class, I've been in talks with Sarah Sachs about getting them to do something with our historic photographs and doing some then now images next semester, I believe. So it'll be interesting to see, because our students are incredibly creative. I think that's what's so exciting about being at Gilman, is that we provide the students with resources and they produce amazing results.
Yeah, once they're exposed to it, they're coming in. Like, I started that cartoon part of the Gilman newspaper last year because I was looking through all the old Gilman news, and I was like, wow, they used to do political or just cartoons about Gilman in here. I think it'd be cool to bring that back. So, and Max was one of the guys who was drawing some cartoons, and we got kind of interrupted with COVID last year, but hoping to start that again because that was interesting, and you're reaching back into history a little bit with that. So hopefully we can continue to do some things like that, get some student involvement.
And as I say, it goes into the archives again. Sort of circles back. I
Right.
keep on collecting the Gilman news. I keep on collecting the yearbooks, and it's a struggle to figure out how to collect with everything being born digital now. But the profession evolves.
Yep.
And it's exciting.
Yep. Social media and Google Drive, all that stuff. Just good. It's easy to organize. It's easy to get out there.
It's a whole other challenge.
Yeah.
I'll say it like that.
Definitely a challenge.
There are advantages, and then I would say sometimes the records from the earlier 1900s are actually easier because there's a finite amount.
Right.
It's in paper.
Yep.
So every new generation of technology has its challenges and has its benefits. Yeah. So it's a evolving profession, the archives world. It's not just white gloves looking at print photographs. There's a lot of digital. So it's an exciting field to be in, but it's definitely one that you have to, like so many fields,
evolve.
You have to stay up to date for sure.
So I was looking back on some of the photos today on Digital Maryland, that whole website with and are there a bunch of schools in that, or is that just Gilman on there?
There are a handful. I think McDonough's just started to put theirs there. But
I was looking at how much Gilman has maybe changed since the outdoor classroom, and what are they wearing, and what are they doing, what are those exercises they're doing on outside during December. It's crazy to me, but I was also thinking about how much Gilman hasn't changed, and some of the same rooms and some of the same buildings. So one of the questions I was going to ask you is, what are some ways that Gilman hasn't changed in your kind of studies or your research?
So ways Gilman has stayed the same.
Yeah.
I think
because I think one part of Gilman is the tradition, and that's something that I cherish about Gilman, is that it has stayed the same, and there are still some of those same traditions.
Yeah.
So I'm curious from your perspective, what has stayed the same, and do you think that's a good thing or not?
I think we still today hold a lot of our founding values and missions. So we were established as a school that was academics, hot lunch, athletics. The thought was that they didn't have to send boys to a New England boarding school or over to Europe to get this well-rounded education. I don't know if you're familiar with, but Anne Galbraith Carey, who founded this school, wanted for her son, and she wanted that her son was still of Baltimore when he finished school. So he wasn't just loyal to his New England boarding school, or would go, I think she'd said, go off to law school and become, be 22 and come back to Baltimore with no connection to the city. Yep. I think Gilman today very much still wants to feel connected of Baltimore. Mr. Finney valued that as well. I've seen strong academics, athletics.
And the mind-body spirit, I think, is for sure emphasized today as much as it has ever been, right? Like,
absolutely.
Academics first, and then the athletic component is huge here. Everyone is required to play a sport. And then the spiritual part has probably evolved the most, but I would say it's still, it's not... Actually, maybe you can talk a little bit about the spiritual component of that mind-body spirit. Because it's not a religious school, but there is definitely a spirit of Gilman, and we've talked about that a little bit on the podcast before.
And it wasn't established as, it was never tied to a church. It was never tied to any particular religious institution.
Mm-hmm.
Our current assembly, though, is an offshoot from what they had chapel for a long time. I don't have a full history of religion at Gilman, but I think we now use spirit to mean more broadly spirit, not religious or affiliated with a specific religion.
Like community and mental health and just like relationships, I'd say. And one of the things that Henry says that I really like is say hey. He says, like, when you're walking around campus, say hey. I think that's part of the spirit, is just knowing each other, being friendly with each other, and building a sense of community.
Yeah, and I think the Gilman Five is a big part of that, to talk about integrity.
Right.
And honor.
And when did that come about, the Gilman Five?
So the ideas have been around for a long time. I believe it was codified under John Schmick, so not that long. John Schmick was a headmaster before Henry Smythe. But the ideas, I mean, I think Ned talked about integrity, talking about Mr. Finney.
Right.
That's a word that comes up a lot. I have the old alumni bulletins, and there's pieces from when he's headmaster where he talks about honor, where he talks about integrity. And those are words of character. Those are words that describe who you want to be. You want to be that first-class citizen. You want to be someone that lives as a genuine person and cares for other people. And I think that's something that we as a school try to teach, try to show. I think as faculty and staff, we are trying to be those people by our actions to show that we care for each other and that we care for this institution.
Definitely. And you talked a little bit about Reddy Finney, who is really the namesake of this podcast after that film that we were talking about earlier, The Path to Follow. And I think is that accessible online through Vimeo, right? Or
I watched it last night again as a refresher. I just found it through Google. I think Maryland Public Television still has it on their website, and I think Amazon Prime as well.
So you can find it online.
You can find it online. I think it is absolutely worth watching, especially if you knew Mr. Finney. Yes. But I think today, for students that don't know Mr. Finney, I think it gives history. I find it inspirational. It gives a sense of purpose. And I think a deeper meaning to what it means to be Gilman. Yeah. But yes, it's online. It's not Gilman was involved, but it was not. It's an independent film.
Did you help out at all in making that? And how did you help out that? Like, because I know you were involved.
It was a large project.
Yeah.
It was one of the more enjoyable projects I've worked on at Gilman. Because reading and research about Mr. Finney it's nice when you're doing research and you feel pride.
Yep.
And you're happy to do this research because everyone enjoys it, and it's Mr. Finney.
Right. It's going to benefit everyone.
It's going to benefit everybody, but you also like when you're doing research and it's especially just general history, and you like the person you're doing research on.
Yeah.
So the school provided, I would say 95% of the images, and the ones the family provided, I think we scanned for them. So it was a lot of research. They weren't just all in one box labeled photographs of Mr. Finney. So it was a lot of digging. It was a lot of looking through past oral histories that we did with him. The video that starts with was in our collection.
What is the video? I forget what
it starts with an interview from 1973.
Oh, right. And he's talking about integrity, right, in that interview?
The ending, he talks about integrity, and that's an interview that the film crew did back in 2018.
Gotcha. Okay.
But this one where he does talk about integrity, but he talks about his life, and also he starts with the, why should private schools be in existence if they're going to be closed to everybody? So if they're not going to open their doors, then they shouldn't exist at all.
Right.
So it's a good, powerful opening.
Great. So we would definitely recommend
Yes.
people, if you haven't seen it, Path to Follow documentary, right? Movie
biopic is the technical. Yes.
Biopic. So watch that. Continue to watch the Path to Follow podcast, because we'll be talking about that. We can't help not talk about Mr. Finney at Gilman, because he's really the core. He represented the core of our identity and who we strive to be, and everything that we talked about, the Gilman Five and mind, body, spirit, all that was what he stood for. So he really is kind of the image, the archetype of what Gilman would like to follow, the path to follow. So Johanna, it was awesome having you on the podcast today. It was a great conversation. We're definitely gonna want to have you back, because you're, as I said at the beginning, a wealth of information, a wealth of knowledge, and we're looking forward to learning more about this place and where we come to school every day, and the history, because the history really is important, and it helps us understand who we are, what we stand for, and where we're going. So thank you again, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
Thanks, Jake.
Yeah.